Hey guys, solo rip from me today. The three topics I'm going to go through, let me get straight into it. So, the fourth turning, tune out, and past life. So, what does that mean? So, first of all, the fourth turning. Have you read a book called literally The Fourth Turning? Have you read a book called The Sovereign Individual? If you haven't read either of those, I highly recommend going and finding them and going through them. And it's not that one's conviction in an asset class or understanding of a technology or just worldview can be built from just one book or two books. But without any doubt, these are two of the most important books I've read in the last, decade, essentially. So to talk about a fourth turning, what is that? Well, it's something that really resonated very strongly with me. And it is a phenomenon that has been studied by humans for a very long time about humans. And back in the Roman days, I believe the phrase was a saeculum, and it basically refers to an 80-year period. And essentially, the reason that history rhymes is because we forget, and certain scenarios that prevail are very real for some, but their kids, not quite so real, and their kids, well, even less real. And so it's this idea that the trauma generated by great moments of fear, great moments of greed, great moments of tragedy, the person that is the living survivor of that experience spends the rest of their life making decisions, specifically from an economics perspective, based on what that was like. And a really random example that's springing to mind right now is that my grandmother, who recently died, R.I.P. Granny, last year, she used to save the wrapping paper of all of the presents that she received. And there was a little drawer in her house somewhere with all of the old wrapping paper. That was my dad's mum. And I feel like we had a similar drawer in our household, which was full of wrapping paper. It might have been old, might have been new, I'm not sure. But as someone who was born and lived, admittedly as a young girl during World War II, they had a lasting mindset from that period of time. If you were born in 1930 and experienced what it was like to be there then, 1940 all the way through, like your parents lived through that as adults, but as a child you experienced that period of time, and as a result, the tragedy what that war was, with a lasting impression on you. And I've never saved a single bit of wrapping paper in my life, to be, bluntly true. And it's because I'm making different economic decisions. Simple as that. Wrapping paper's not expensive for me to buy, and it's not hard to get, and therefore it's not a big deal if I get rid of it. Now that's a really random example that popped to mind, but the obvious one, when someone like myself, who's a kind of student of the history of money and is a big Bitcoin advocate, printing money is something that's been tried before. Let's be perfectly honest. Today it's called quantitative easing, or it's called stimulus, or whatever they come up with as a different phrase. It's been tried before. And if you go back and study this, there's numerous different occasions where it tried and failed very spectacularly. And the point is that goods and services that an economy generates, if you have more monetary units in that economy, there's not more goods and services. And people, through the Cantillon experience, so Richard Cantillon, which was a, I can't remember roughly the era that he was around, but forgive me, you'll have to look it up. He coined the idea of being close to the monetary spigot. So it's the idea of, the closer you are to the king, the closer you are to the money, the closer you are to the power, the closer that you are to basically being able to squeeze a bit extra for yourself before the rest of the population can have a crack. And it's described basically the idea of money printing. If you print a load of money and you give it to your buddies first, and they manage to buy all the actual goods, services, and assets in the economy before anyone realizes that the money's been printed, then you basically have an insider benefit from your societal position. And yeah, so this idea of a fourth turning, what is it? Well, basically, it rhymes very nicely with the idea that strong men create good times create soft men, and soft men create bad times, and bad times create strong men. And so I may have slightly butchered that quote, but it's this idea that we go in cycles. And it's kind of like the seasons, right? You've got the hotter period of the year, the colder period of the year, and then the spring and autumn in between. And it's the same with human decision making over multiple generations. Now, the question here is obviously like, what are we doing right now? Where are we in this process? Shout out to Mark Moss, who's done some great content that I've been through around technology, politics, and what was the other area he looks at? Forgive me, I've forgotten. There's a third one, but he looks at these different cycles, and he's absolutely bang on. And it kind of chimes along with the idea of a fourth turning. Anyway, what does it mean? Well, right now, according to the study I've done, we're in a phase of fourth turning. And they basically are like major upheavals. Things go wrong, things break. Often people die. Now, as brutal as that is, like, what does that actually look like in today's world? Well, we're not going to be sent off and fight in a trench, like 100 years ago. There's going to be large missiles fired if that was to happen. I'm absolutely of no doubt we're in an information war already. Like, how you get people to think is critical to winning democratic elections. It's clearly a system that's been very, very effective for some people. And so this is just quite a helpful framework to think about risk. What is risky? And the average financial advisor, and this is particularly from an investment perspective, we're like, okay, well, here's what we're going to do. We're going to take your money and we're going to split it into a 60-40 bond and stock portfolio. Depending on how much risk you want to take, they might, flip those allocations around. You'll get some fixed income revenues generated out of that bond portfolio. You might have some decent dividend paying stocks in the stock allocation, and they'll basically fudge the numbers at year end to see if you've actually beaten inflation or not. And obviously they'll use CPI, which is a heavily doctored number, and one I personally don't pay any attention to whatsoever. Basically, it's like, what's the cost of the stuff I actually want to buy? Beef, house, car, and what was it last year? Like, has it gone up? Yes or no? If it's gone up, what's it gone up by? And it can be as high as 20-25%. So the real inflation rate is absolutely, rampant. And in environments like this, you look at debt to GDP ratios of some of these like leading nation states. The US is the easy one to kind of have a crack at, but there's a ton of others. And it's like, they're completely bankrupt. And if they don't print more money, then the cost of their interest burden alone will wipe them out. And a bunch of them have already reached points of no return, in my opinion. Historically, if you hit roughly 120, 130% debt to GDP, you ain't coming back. Simple as that. And so what does that mean? It's like, well, actually, maybe we're living through a period of time now which is extremely high risk. And so when they say, let's put some money in bonds, let's put some money in the stock market, well, how do you actually own that stuff? Well, you have some kind of money manager. You might get a physical piece of paper that has a share certificate. You might have a digital portal somewhere which you can log into and see how these assets are held. But like, what if a government goes bankrupt? Like the bond allocation, if it was a UK gilt or a Bund from Germany, or the Eurozone itself, or a US Treasury, any one of these places, what if those governments actually fail? Well, you've got proper counterparty risk, and you dig a little deeper into those bond issuances, and you can see quite clearly that often there's just no demand. And where's it going? It's going to the central bank. So again, they're kind of fudging the system, they're fudging the numbers, which is kind of scary, to be honest. And then on the flip side, you have this thing called Bitcoin, which, as you know, I talk about a lot, but its performance the last 10 years has been absolutely extraordinary. But that does not mean it's definitely going to carry on, right? This idea that past performance is not indicative of future performance. So you've got to be really, really careful of that. Absolutely no doubt about it. But I think you can build a very strong case that shows that the tailwinds for Bitcoin are extremely strong. But what I really love about it, when you're in this like fourth turning period, if you agree with that thesis that like right now, there's just so many people that are in positions of real power that are running it. They're running things recklessly. Like they've forgotten what it means to have a complete meltdown of the monetary system. They've forgotten what it feels to have like an all-out world war. They've forgotten what it feels like to actually, have nothing. And I'm talking specifically about the people in positions of real power. I think it's very clear on the street. You walk around and people are struggling. Like it's like inflation is really hitting people hard. And unsurprisingly, right, when things get 30, 40, 50% more expensive in a 5-year period and you can't earn any more, like you're getting really fucking screwed. And that's kind of scary, right? You've got a whole subset of the population getting more and more frustrated, more and more underwater, higher and higher debts from households, etc. And on the flip side, you've got a bunch of reckless decision makers that have forgotten what it feels like to have a difficult day. And this all kind of combines together to just be careful, essentially. Like, why do I own what I own? Even things like, let's say I saw today a report, BHP Billiton, a mining company with hard assets, had actually performed pretty well as an equity over the last 5 years. And it was a comparison between some different allocations you could make to some companies and what the money supply had actually done. And it had done okay. It hadn't completely outpaced inflation, but like its returns were just about all right. But let's say you did have a portfolio that was able to match the real inflation rate. Have you actually considered the custody of it? And if you have to call up a financial advisor who then has to call up a fund manager, who then has to think about how they actually own that thing, and it can take a number of days to liquidate a position, do you really own that thing? No. You have a piece of paper that says you have a claim on it. Now, yes, it might be the case that the issuance of stock in a company is very cleverly and very importantly, managed by a legal system that makes sure that you don't sell the same shares twice. Like that's an absolute given, right? You want to make sure that you're working with people that are high integrity, that they're running their equity investing from a very well regulated perspective. But do you truly take custody of that equity? No. Do you truly take custody of that bond? No. And so what I would push to you is like, well, what does that mean? So if we're in a fourth turning and things are about to get really, really, really hairy, if you don't own stuff that you think you own and there's a big panic, well, what happens if you can't get it? That's a seriously big deal. And that's why Bitcoin is such an important thing to own, in particular, self-custody, right? And if you haven't figured out what that is yet, you need to start learning, because to me, it's like it's a superpower, right? You're able to put value into this digital asset that sits somewhere that is very, very safe, depending on how you custody it, whether you just keep the seed phrase in your head, whether you have a globally dispersed multi-sig setup with an inheritance plan. There's a number of different ways of doing it, right? You can roll your own seed phrase. You can have different types of hardware wallet help you out. You can involve different family members. There's tons of different ways of doing it. But you actually have ownership of that Bitcoin if you do it correctly. And that, I think, is something that people really miss. So, okay, fine. There might be a more traditional asset that is able to maybe keep up with Bitcoin. Okay, well, on paper, that's a good thing. But when it comes to the actual ownership of it, what does that mean? I'm in the process of reading The Big Print, Larry Lepard's book. Larry, shout out to you. I've learned so much from you over the years. But one story he tells that resonates so strongly is, as a fund manager, he shorted the financial stocks in 2008, and Freddie and Fannie Mae, other parts of the real estate industry, because it was clear to him that they were completely fucked. And they all colluded. They said it's actually not possible for anyone to short our stock. The government came out and said it's illegal. And instead of being 50% ahead for the year, he ended up 6% down. He had to unwind those positions. You just think, oh, wow. A brilliant actual example of how when the game is rigged and controlled by other people, they will use that card when necessary. Now, was 2008 the beginning of this fourth turning period? Will 2030-ish roughly be the end of it? Maybe. Right now, 2025, like what's going to happen? Someone going to fire a nuke? Is there going to be a huge bit of stimulus that gets announced? I don't know. But what's important is just to sit down and go, okay, what's going on here? Have the people, have we fallen asleep at the wheel here? Have things got completely out of hand and we just haven't quite realized? to make another strange analogy, but I spend every day with my kids. And therefore, I just don't see how fast they're growing. But when family members of mine see them after 6 months, they're like, whoa, they've changed so much. And that could be our economic situation right now. We spend every day in it. And therefore, the gradual creep, the cracks that start to appear, they're just not as obvious. And so that's why I like to own Bitcoin in self-custody, because I actually own it. And I'm fully aware that the saeculum may well be coming to a very, very kind of frosty end. So I'll leave you with that. Basically, get out, go and read The Fourth Turning, and also have a look at a book called The Sovereign Individual. And the two of them together are critical pieces to understanding why, well, in a sense, there's inevitability about the emergence of a free market money that was applicable for the digital realm. And in particular, The Sovereign Individual is just an extraordinary book that gives you, like, it was so on point, and it was written a long time before Bitcoin was even created. One final point actually that's come to mind on that, which was, there was a guy, I'm not going to mention his name because it doesn't really matter, but someone who I came across roughly 2016, who I really was quite inspired by, similar age to myself. He'd been extremely successful setting up a startup-related accelerator program in the UK and wrote a really, really impressive newsletter. And he just was quite impressive. And I remember getting extreme compare and despair, and ended up, I went different paths. But the newsletter once, he basically made a reference to The Sovereign Individual. He referenced it as a very popular book in certain realms of the technology world, but it's not worth looking at. And I haven't even bothered reading it and just dismissed it. And it was one of those moments you go, hang on a second, is this guy actually that smart? And when it's something that you go and read and resonates really, really strongly with you, in particular, this whole Bitcoin piece, incidentally, this guy's now a quite senior AI policy thought leader, and I think he's even helping put together legislation for the current UK Labour government. So, like, right in there with a nation state. You think, isn't that interesting? Someone who's so easy to dismiss a book that really talks about the disintermediation of nation states and the rise of the individual and the important recorrection of individual rights. And they just wrote it off. So I guess what's the summary there? The summary there is you can go out and collect information of your own that's different to other people and have a different view of the world to other people. A, that's okay. B, don't worry about what they're doing. Focus on what feels right for you. And I think that is a really magic point, because all too often that kind of compare and despair things like, oh, that person's so successful, oh, they did so well doing this. But then they haven't read a fundamental book that you love. And in fact, they dismiss it to an entire newsletter subscriber base. It's like, whoa, okay, well, maybe that's the edge. Maybe that's the insight. And, I would argue it's been absolutely worth doing from my perspective. Okay, so that was number one, the fourth turning. Now I just want to talk about tuning out. I had a cool conversation this week with Nathan Smith. Check out that podcast. And Nathan is he's a digitally low profile character, which I love. And he has such an impressive background. I love getting to know him in person. And I really appreciate coming across characters like him who, A, aren't interested in the limelight, so to speak. They're not interested in perhaps what I'm doing, to be perfectly honest, like getting out there and creating content. But the decisions that they've made, the work they do is very, very high quality. And they're just typical of someone who gets into Bitcoin in a way. That they live on sound money. They start to make better decisions. They start to feel better. And the output is, what's the right way of saying it? I don't know, it's a really healthy indifference for what we're told is important. And in particular, what's resonated with me is this idea of just tune the fuck out. And let's think about this, for example. You wake up in the morning, and this is not uncommon for me. Like, I'm being woken up by a child at some point. You're like, oh, fuck. You wake up, and you're like, oh, I better just check my phone. And before you know it, you've like had a quick check on WhatsApp to make sure that you haven't got a message from a family member, and there's no big deal. But then you catch yourself looking at your Nostr feed or checking the Bitcoin price, or like maybe your podcast email, and you get distracted and you go down this whole hole. And before you know it, 10 minutes has gone by and the child's still screaming at your feet and you haven't done what you think you're originally doing, and suddenly your brain's completely distracted. And such is the nature of like the addiction of a smartphone. It's absolutely mad how well they've built those products to catch our attention and to keep it. But the point here is, like, what is the newsreel? Who's even creating that, right? Like, for example, I think about in Australia, there's Channel 7 or Channel 9. They're these like broadcasters, and they'll get like the Australian Open, and they have a news show at 6 p.m. every night. And it's a kind of very traditional media model in that sense, with then adverts that pop up, or a more modern version of like just a Facebook, right? For every 3 kind of social media posts, there's then some kind of paid for advertising. And even politics, right, just gets thrown down your throat. It's like thing that's important, but like, is it actually important? Does it actually improve your life? What if you just ignore it? Like, completely ignore it, like switch off, tune out, and go, whatever, you guys crack on. I'm not interested in following along. And I think the truth is, it's awesome. You start to feel better. You get less anxious. You get less distracted. You have more time to yourself. And this is where it gets quite spiritual. You can almost do it now. Like, you can just kind of slow down and tune into yourself. And from there comes consciousness in a way. You can talk to something else. Now, I'm not an expert in this by any means, but I have experienced some quite extraordinary things in the last couple of years through meditation, through manifestation, through vision setting. And it's wild, to be honest. What the hell is that? Like, as a creative tool, what am I being built? Like, what am I here for? What can I go and do? And I think tuning out is a key part of that, like creating more time for yourself. A big part for me, for example, is the realization that I'm never going to have a fiat employment contract ever again. So the idea of a 22-day holiday year and being on someone else's beck and call for however many hours per week, strapped onto your mobile phone, I'm never doing that. And with that comes an extraordinary amount of time. You're like, oh, wow, I've got my time back. What do I do with it? Well, it's up to you, right? What comes to you? And it's then this cool thing. Like, I used to think that building entrepreneurial projects was all about kind of customer feedback or customer discovery, like going out there, what's someone's problem? How do you find the strongest or hardest or most acute problem? Focus on that. But you've got to make sure that acute problem is also in like a large market, and you've got to make sure that large market is potentially disruptable, and that actually you're the person that can go and disrupt that market. And it's almost like what's the right way of saying it? It's a systematized process. I think there's an MIT book actually that you can buy that takes you through this. It's a very scientific approach to innovation, and I like that. It's a system, but it has no space for intuition. Has no space for the inner voice. Has no space for the build it and they will come approach. Is that really the right way to go? I don't know, and that's where you have to try, right? You have to just try, and try again. And see what works, see what sticks. So long story short, not that I don't buy Bitcoin for this reason, but one thing that it does is, because it's a separate monetary system, it's decentralized. You can take self-custody. With that, it buys you the ability to tune out. You don't need to care who's in political power. You don't need to care what the latest stock market report was. You don't need to care if there's a new fashion trend, or there's some kind of crypto token that's a pre-launch that you can, oh my God, become a millionaire overnight. And I think that's really cool, because it allows people the space to then really home in on, like, what do I care about? What do I love? What am I getting guided towards? How do I want to express myself in the world? How do I want to show up? And, I'm into that, to be honest. Like, it clearly creates, I like that phrase, like a more based character. They're just not as flappable, right? They're not living on the same kind of cortisol levels of dopamine addiction. Like, oh my God, got to wake up and it just addict you to the news feed. It's like, no, I don't give a shit what the newsfeed says, because my everyday is here now, and I navigate everything through that process. So I thought that was really cool. And, if anyone out there, this resonates with them, please do get in touch, because I'd love to know, like, what have you achieved due to tuning out? Or what have you, even achieved puts too much of a label on it. What have you enjoyed as a result of doing that? Okay, so to my last point, I'm going to talk about past life experience I just had. So I won't mention his name either, actually, because he's going to come on the podcast, hopefully. But this is an osteopath that I came across in my local area recently. And I was extremely stressed, very upset with an emotional problem that appeared. And again, I don't want to share too much about it because it's private, but it was like deeply triggering. And I didn't know what to do about it. I reached out to him. I was like, okay, I need some help. And he's like, cool, we can do a video session about it later. And on the video call, it was lasted for an hour, and he was chatting to me about what was going on. And you may or may not have seen, but in East Australia, we are basically, everyone's hiding at home. There's a cyclone just about to hit mainland, and my wife and I and kids, we've left Byron Bay where we live and moved to Sydney for a week to avoid the storm. And, I've already got a text message from my electricity provider to say that there's no power at home, which would have been a fucking disaster with 3 kids under 4, or 3 kids under 5 even, and no electricity. So I'm glad we made the move, and obviously take care of everyone who stayed behind. We really, really hope everything's going to be okay. But it was a tornado. And he's like, God, that feels like a tornado, what you just described. It's like, wow, what's going on here? It's like a tornado in my life. Wow, relationships that I thought were completely dependable actually weren't. And because of me, it's like, oh shit, what have I done? I've just been myself. Well, if I've just been myself, it's someone else's bullshit, someone else's emotional baggage. But number one thing I always like to say is, if the information changes, the act of stupidity is not evolving yourself. And so I got a hold of this guy, and we're doing this session, and he's trying to prod and poke me, just chatting on a video call. I'd felt this strong inclination to lie on a bed and talk. And then he gets like, okay, you ready do you feel like just dropping into this a bit? And I'm like, yeah, sure. So I started kind of meditating with him, and he starts talking through, like, how do I feel? And it gets much more basic, right? You really tune into your body. And I started talking about how I felt. And slowly but surely he amped it up a little bit. It's like, where's the light? Can you see any light? And I got this extraordinary thing where from my left eyelid, I could just see from my left foot straight into my left eye, this white light. And the left foot is connected to our spiritual path. Whatever you want that to mean. It's extraordinary. And again, just guiding, it's like a guided meditation by this point. And I'm like describing different lights that I could see, and it would move to different parts of my head. And before you know it, I woke up on the bed. It's like, what the fuck happened? And I just heard the front door slamming shut with kids coming home. I was like, oh my God, what happened to my call? And I logged back into the video call, which had dropped out. This is now like 58 minutes into the hour. And he's like, oh, you're back. How was it? I was like, what the hell just happened? And well, I don't really know is the answer. I went to this extraordinary place. And what it was described to me as is past life healing. Now, I don't know if this is a term you've ever come across before, but this is working in different types of energetics. This is working in different levels of spirituality. This is working in, like, what's the right way of saying it? An alternative reality. It's like, what do you mean past life? And what do you mean where did I just disappear to? And it was like I went into this whole other world, and I just dropped out. Oof, gone. And the mad thing is, it's literally like the Matrix, right? It's like I got unplugged for about 10 minutes. I was out for, and I went to another world. And I'm like, I came back, replugged into this like physical body. I'm like, ding, back in, and there was some deep trauma that my soul had experienced in a different life. All this goes to say, like, the Jake of, even 5 years ago would never ever have been A, open to thinking about this, B, consider it to be anything close to being real, and C, actually experience it. I think that's the main thing here, is actually the experience I went through. Like, I was there. I mean, I wasn't for like 10 minutes, right? I was in this another world, in extraordinarily deep sleep, meditation induced, guided through some kind of spiritual process. And it was like a cleansing. And I came back out of it. And after the session, I felt so fresh. I still didn't quite know exactly how I was going to deal with the problem that had surfaced for me and the situation that I was in. But something happened. And yeah, it's just fun to share that with you. Anyway, that's me for the rip today. Thank you so much for joining. And I guess I'll leave it as this, like, just be open-minded. Join me with being open-minded. Thank you.